Alrighty, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. We are working with our landscape painting in this video demonstration. What is being projected on my second camera, as you can see, is my glass palette, which is around 12 by 15 inches in terms of its measurement. Again, those of you who want to utilize plastic palettes, you're more than happy to. They are available at any art craft store. And you can get them in a pack, which looks similar to this. They come in multiple sheets. I think, to my knowledge, you can't get sheets of 50 or sheets of 10. But just for the sake of this demo, we're actually going to be utilizing a glass palette for the landscape painting. I do have a variety of colors here that we're going to be using. I have raw umber, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, French ultramarine blue, Prussian blue, and titanium white. I also have two sort of sections of the titanium white. I also do have, in terms of my medium, I have my liquid quick dry medium I'm going to be using from Winsor Newton. And again, these are all sort of Winsor Newton brands. Not limited to any other brands in terms of Utrecht or Dick Blick's or even Rembrandt's types of paints that you can use for this assignment. But I just actually would like to recommend the Winsor Newton brands, which are a little bit better quality than some of the other traditional ones. Also, in terms of my actual palette knife, I do have a sort of a metal palette knife I'm going to be using. And in terms of my brushes, I do have a synthetic fan brush, a number 16 brush, as well as a number, if I'm not mistaken, this is a number 8. And this is actually a Bristol brush with 2 synthetic. And I also have a larger brush I'm going to be using just to sort of get my base of my ground. This is a number 12 Bristol brush, which is flat. And just for the sake of the demo, I'll sort of utilize this in the beginning of the painting to sort of draw out my composition within this process. Remember to keep in mind, some of these materials are interchangeable. I really want everybody to just take your time and really kind of get in this sort of format of really utilizing your palettes first in the beginning of the paintings that we work on throughout the semesters, and really utilizing how we can sort of manage and micromanage sort of color palettes. I do have my warmer colors up here towards my top, and then I have my sort of cooler colors here on my right-hand side. And actually, one of the reasons why I do this is sort of, it helps me utilize a sort of a grid method. So for example, if I mix my yellow ochre, my blue, my French ultramarine, and my yellow ochre, I'll mix it right about here. And that will actually remind me to see how I mix these colors together. And then same thing here from my cadmium yellow all the way down here from my Prussian blue. I'm gonna make a sort of another sort of color here, which I'm gonna be utilizing. All right, everyone, so what I'm gonna do is actually start just mixing some of my colors together. I'm gonna take a little bit of my French ultramarine blue and actually make 2 kind of areas in my palette just to kind of have a little bit of my blue laid down. So I can start mixing some of my cadmium red. And this is a sort of a ratio of 50-50. Again, I really want to sort of get in there. Notice the ways in which I'm moving my palette from left to right, kind of working in counterclockwise or even clockwise circular motions. Get a nice sort of like deeper brown violet. Really, and part of this process is getting, really familiar with the materials and kind of feeling how the oils is starting to bend and starting to mesh together in terms of mixing. Again, just sort of lifting it off the palette as much as I can and sort of laying it out. I'm going to let that be for now. I'm going to also do, I like to keep a paper towel in hand on my left-hand side. I'm right-handed, so I'll keep the paper towel on my left hand. I'm going to take a little bit of my yellow ochre and actually mix it to some of the ultramarine blues that I've made here. And if you mix those 2 colors together, you get a nice sort of earth green, almost a naturalistic green, which is fantastic. Some of this up. And keep in mind, obviously, this process will be a little bit messy, which is completely okay. but part of the learning process is also just kind of getting familiar with the material. I'm now going to take some cadmium yellow, okay? And I'm going to take a little bit of the cadmium red, not too much, because again, cadmium colors are really, really strong and really saturated and vibrant. I sort of want to make a sort of a brighter orange. A nice sort of orange color here. And then I'm also going to just sort of clean off my palette knife. I'm also going to add a little bit of the alizarin crimson on the slightly to the right. Not too much. I don't want to take all of that off the palette. Right about there. And I'm actually going to mix that slightly with some of the orange color that I had earlier, that I just made here. I want to see how that blends together. Be careful not to touch my cooler Prussian blue here towards my right. And an interesting sort of like almost brighter red orange, which is interesting. Picked up some of that blue, which is okay. And you can see now it starts to become a little bit darker. I'm adding a little bit more of that Prussian blue. And you can also see it almost becomes like a violet brown, which is interesting. Okay, but now what I'm going to do is actually start mixing some of my whites into these palettes, just so I can get a sort of familiar idea of how I can desaturate some of the color. Take a little bit of the white here. I'm actually going to lay it onto 3 parts. This is again sort of one method of making some of the areas on your palette sort of mix. But I also want to sort of have fun in this process and start exploring what ways in terms I can start to mix some of my colors. Now I'm sort of desaturating some of my colors here, mixing a little bit of that yellow ochre and ultramarine blue that we made earlier, adding a little bit of the white so you get a nice sort of green, earthier gray. And this is more toward aligned to the cooler grays. Okay. And now I'm going to clean up my palette. And I'm going to do the same thing here with my cadmium yellow and cadmium red mixture. And lastly, I'm going to do the same thing with my crimson red combination color that we made earlier. A little bit more white. Almost a sort of violet, lighter pink blush, almost dulled down, desaturated red. This is a sort of a really interesting start to kind of, again, get familiar with some of the paints we're going to be utilizing for the landscape, as well as familiarizing ourselves within the palette. I'm also going to put my palette on the side for a second so I can showcase a earlier sort of grid I made with some canvas paper. And we're going to actually talk a little bit about this later on in the lecture and then in the demonstration, excuse me. And I wanted to sort of highlight and showcase areas within the paint itself that I wanted to use for my complementary palette, which is more of my French ultramarine blue in relationship to my sort of orange complementary color. So I have my orange and blue palettes. So here you can see there's a sort of a grid towards the left-hand side of adding just the pure orange I mixed earlier with some cadmium yellow and cadmium red. And a little bit, now I'm sort of adding a little bit more of that French ultramarine blue. And just for the sake of the experimentation, I made a sort of cadmium yellow and crimson orange. So it's a little bit redder And now you can see here gradually adding more of the Prussian blue to see what happens in terms of the reactions. You can see it's also, the palettes are slightly different in terms of it's a little bit more greener here, it's a little bit more bluer, so you can see those intensities of both blues. Here's a value scale of just adding white from the French ultramarine, and here's another value scale of just adding white on top of that orange. And then now what we're gonna do is now switch to the canvas itself. Alrighty, and then in this part of the actual demonstration, we're going to talk a little bit about the canvas. I do have an 18 by 24 inch already stretched and primed white canvas for the demo. For the sake of the actual demo itself, we're going to be using this size, the minimum size of 18 by 24. What I also do have is the same size already primed, ready to go, and I did add a layer of a color that I wanted to sort of discuss. I added burnt sienna as my base, mixed with a lot of liquid, and just to sort of give a nice sort of warmer base under painting before we start our actual landscape painting. And one of the reasons why we do this is to sort of kind of not only have this sort of very intimidating white background to start within the painting, but it actually helps neutralize all the other colors we're going to start to add when we start actually applying our blues and orange tints, tones, and shades of our color itself. So all of the hues would actually work and complement with each other once we actually add the dead layer or the under layer painting of the burnt sienna.